started in just a few minutes, so if we could start filtering in.
I'll pay you later for that comment.
I thought you were up there.
Have a good one, man. But I'm so glad you're on this panel because it needed some balance.
Okay. All right.
They're both here. They're on their way out.
Okay. John, Harry Surden. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming. All right, if we could please take our seats. We're about to begin. All right, so welcome to our third panel, Disruption and the Internet. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Harry Surden. I'm a professor at the law school here. I teach and research on intellectual property law issues and technology and law issues generally. And I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion panel today. Before I introduce my distinguished panelists, let me just say a few words of context. So, the internet from its very beginnings has been disruptive of the way we do things. Even from the start, it disrupted the way the military and academics communicated with one another, its origins, allowing communication in ways that were not previously possible. And then starting in about 1995, it began disrupting the business community with the first and second wave of disruptive internet companies. These include Amazon, Google, eBay, Facebook, some of the household names you're familiar with. And once again, in just the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen what might be termed a third wave of disruptive innovation driven by the internet. In many cases, these have been enabled either by new technologies or by decreasing costs of existing technologies. So some of examples that come to mind are things like Netflix streaming, which was in turn enabled by disruptive technologies such as Amazon Web Services and platforms, as well as technological changes in reduced costs in transmitting video. The smartphone revolution, another technology introduced by Apple's iPhone in 2007, which in turn enabled several other technologies and disruptive business models that themselves would have been previously infeasible. I'm thinking of companies like Square, which allow for mobile internet payments, credit cards on the fly. So the smartphone combined with ubiquitous internet has allowed also new technologies and enabled part of the sharing economy, so-called sharing economy, things like Airbnb and Uber. And finally, there are just simply new business models that have not been thought of that are coming around. Companies like Kickstarter, which is disrupting funding, Coursera, disrupting higher education. And then, of course, in the background, there are some current technologies that are either in the process of disrupting or just about to disrupt. I'm thinking of things like data analytics, Bitcoin, cloud computing, new artificial intelligence techniques, and ubiquitous sensors. So we're going to focus on all of these disruptive business models related to the internet. And joining me in this topic is a very distinguished panel. In the interest of time, let me only briefly introduce them, but I recommend that you look at their distinguished biographies in the brochure. To my left, I have John Levisay, the founder and chief executive of Craftsy, Daniel Lewin, corporate vice president of technology and civic engagement at Microsoft, Ryan McIntyre, managing director of the Foundry Group, and Sarah Shoup, chief executive officer and founder of University Parent. So let's start with a few questions for our panelists, and I'm going to throw this one out to Daniel. So the internet has two important characteristics that facilitate disruptive technologies. Number one, it lowers barriers to entry for new entrepreneurs. And number two, it allows entrepreneurs to connect with markets that are distant geographically. So give your thoughts on these characteristics or others of the internet in facilitating disruption.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe first I wanted to say, after listening to the two other panels, which were really extraordinary in many ways, that it's probably appropriate that this one goes last. So I think Phil did a good job in organizing that, mostly because of a story that came to mind about being in a place long ago where Bill Gates and Gordon Moore were in the same room, and Bill was talking about the software sort of revolution and it being magic, and Gordon Moore kind of smiled and said, yes, but it must run on something. So he was the hardware guy. So without electricity, right, we wouldn't have the telecommunications infrastructure, and without that we wouldn't have the internet, and without that we wouldn't have all of this disruption. So I thought it's kind of nice the way things unfolded. I also thought I'd start a little bit with sort of a baseline definition about innovation and the way I would think about it relative to things internet. First, at the core, I think innovation is about economic impact, and so I was really pleased to see people talking a lot about that in the earlier panels. And the disruption, which is the change in the flow of information over the internet, comes about as a result of calculation that since lost and therefore deceased researcher from Microsoft, a guy named Jim Gray, who was kind of a citizen of the industry as opposed to working for any particular company. He put a paper online, which is still up there that you could look at, about the economics of distributed computing. And so one of the things to think about, and it sort of drew me back to the last thing said in the last panel, is that it's really the price parity among 5 things that drives the economics of distributed computing, which is really what the internet's all about. And the first was about database access, the cost of accessing a database. The second was the number of bytes that you move over a network and how much it costs, the number of instructions that run per penny or dollar, and then the density of disk storage, and then finally the cost of the bandwidth. And so there's a calculation that gets run all the time about where the computing is done. And we've seen this incredible run-up in the internet and therefore massive disruption in the last little while to the businesses that have been named, from Amazon or Google or others, as a result of the economics of really handling the data at the core. And Ryan knows a lot about that from his experiences. But it's always been the case that when the researchers run this calculation, it's really at the edge is where the compute cycles, where all the data is, and it's both collected, and eventually there'll be some model changes that occur. So to answer your question with that as a little bit of background, I think that there's 3 or 4 areas where the disruption occurs and is going to continue to occur. One is at the core, and it's going to continue beyond search as sort of the core, where people are using advertising as the financing model and counting clicks and things of that ilk, and beyond sort of consumer applications like downloading music or moving pictures around and things of that ilk, which come from phones, which are just a bunch of sensors at the edge of the network. Then there are these newer models which are pushing the edge of disruption, which gets into policy and regulation, like Uber, which is really a service that doesn't really do much more than matching, but in turn creates immense disruption and real opportunity. So there's lots of those kinds of things that are going to occur. And all of this is sort of built on the shoulders of the difference between the capital equipment expenditure versus an operating sort of cost expenditure based upon these big cloud computing architectures. And so the cloud computing architectures, just to take that forward, I think are going to center in maybe 10 big companies. And it's around that these models will emerge. Clearly it's Google, clearly Amazon, Microsoft's in the game. The big telcos, to the point, I think have to do certain things. Certain sovereign states are going to do it in one way, shape, or form, whether you think the current and hot new IPO is really a company or a government entity, who knows, if you think about China and what's going on there, if you think about regulation and markets. So To me, there's this really fascinating moment that we're at right now where so much of it is optimized against these big machine architectures that have been built at the core because of the data being collected. But I think there'll be some shifts in the not too distant future where the edge devices can turn into the most powerful and important market opportunities. And that would assume that the market that you are when you go to Facebook because you give them your trail, you might be able to control your trail and auction it off. So I think things can flip over time where you, with your device, because the computing cost, the storage cost, and all the bandwidth cost, will balance out again. A little bit like client-server, where a lot of the data was stored on the server side, and on the client side is where the application logic was. But PCs started out being very powerful because they could crunch data that couldn't be done at the core in an effective way. So that's sort of a bunch of stuff that I think maybe we can all work with, and I thought maybe a foundation for, anyway, lots of topics.
Good. So let me throw the same question out to the rest of the panel. Disruptive characteristics of the internet, reflections?
Well, sure. I mean, one thing, in hearing Daniel's great explanation of sort of the core trends is also to add on top of that is the overlay that one of the things that's profound about the internet is not only is it sort of computation and data collection medium and a total shift in sort of how we do computing architecture, but it overlays a number of virtual communication networks, right? And that the internet now includes humans as endpoints. And that has enabled an incredible degree of sort of individual and collective coordination, right? That's enabled social media, flash mobs, revolutions, telemetry and dispatch systems like Uber. And so I would add that as an overlay to the enabling technologies that Daniel described.
So it sounds like you're saying even if not creating entirely new disruptive technologies, it's facilitating even existing business models in certain ways.
Well, I would say it's doing more than facilitating models. It's actually enabling disruptive means of interaction and communication that have never before existed or never been practical on the scale they are now, right? So it's sort of enabling an accelerated exchange of knowledge, value, et cetera, right? So there's a semantic layer that's happening on top of it that is also fundamentally enabling new things, right? Airbnb or Uber couldn't exist without smartphones and hundreds of millions or billions of people interacting on a network.
Great. Other comments from the panel?
I think from the entrepreneur perspective, it just provides such an amazing platform for people to really disrupt these great big industries that have existed for so long in a way that's really inexpensive and really accessible for a teenager. And so I think that's the thing that's so fascinating to think through, how the model will affect the greater public, and then how the greater public can really either feel safe when they're using these different technologies and trust the technology, and even knowing what's the tipping point when people decided that it was okay to get into an Uber car or to stay in an Airbnb rental.
Great.
I think it's been well said.
Okay, great. So let's move on to a different topic here, and I'm going to throw this out to Ryan. So we're talking about disruptive innovation here. Do we see patterns as to how this disruption occurs looking back relative to the internet? And is it usually facilitated by a new technology, or are there other features that we might be overlooking?
So, I mean, again, given that I've lived my entire career in technology, I will, of course, apply the lens of a lot of these disruptions being enabled by new technologies over time. But, as I was thinking about this subject on the way over while I was sitting on a delayed airplane, one of my observations that's interesting, and it sort of overlays with the social piece, but also the evolution over time of sort of this exponential growth enabled by Moore's law and sort of the variance, Metcalfe's law, the value of a network is sort of the relative to the square of the number of nodes in it, et cetera, right? All of these things pertain, but if you look at sort of the history of computation to date, I think, and then sort of project it forward, I think to me one of the fascinating things is you look at the birth of the earliest computers and then mini computers and whatnot, and those were measured in the magnitudes of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of them over time, right? You got to the PC revolution, again, prior to the internet revolution, before we'd wired all these things together, and you were talking hundreds of millions of devices, right? And then as we moved forward into the smartphone, tablet computing revolution, et cetera, now we're talking billions of devices, right? And billions of individuals on those devices. And so you're seeing this kind of order of magnitude trend. And if we fast forward and you think about things like the Internet of Things or wearable computing and whatnot, right? That's sort of another step forward where you're looking at, okay, you've got humans who have a smartphone, a tablet, a computer, numbering in the billions, and then you think of the constellation of devices that exist around each human or in each home or in each car or in each factory, and you're seeing another exponential change again of sort of nodes and endpoints in the network, right? So where you're going from billions to tens of billions and even to trillions over time. And so one of the things you see in that sort of exponential curve that sort of technology change represents too is that the sort of endpoints and addressable devices, input devices, nodes, sensors, et cetera, over time also continues to increase exponentially, and to me that's fertile ground for hunting for new opportunities going forward.
Reactions to that? Or further comments?
Oh, I'm happy to talk. I thoroughly agree with the scale at which you can attack a problem to the entrepreneur point of view, which is within the last 10 years, more or less, people would spend millions of dollars buying hardware and software to get something going and take multiple years to come up with something that was reasonable that they might test in the marketplace. And now, for pennies an hour, you can be up and running almost in real time. So there will be there are an incredible number of interesting new things that will bubble up that will have huge impact economically on the entrepreneurs making tons of money. It's widely talked about in the newspapers, in the last day or two about Microsoft looking, and I don't know anything about it, so full disclosure, but Minecraft, I'm just reading what's in the paper, and what is it? It's 20 or 30 people. They did, I don't know, $300 million of business or something and made $100 million in profit last year.
Never raised any venture capital.
Never raised any money. They just paid by the hour and bought into these infrastructure services. So that goes back to when I got in this business in 1977, where timeshare was this radical, it was the name of a company, and it was a radical new concept. It had been invented on a university campus, Dartmouth College, on Honeywell mainframes, and BASIC was the programming language, and the president of Dartmouth had invented that. So all these things were going on, and then microprocessors kind of blossomed, and standalone operating systems and PCs, and then all the rational tasks, moving words and text and numbers and pictures around, got automated into a stack. All that was envisioned in the 70s. It took 25 years for it to play out in the market. And then kind of the internet bubble, if you will, burst, mostly because the technology companies took advantage of a moment in time to sell a huge amount of stuff to enterprises based on fear, right? Y2K. And then they had to digest it all. And the customers forced the tech companies to drive interoperability among the different architectures, and it became the data layer where things moved around. So that's really where the web started to blossom. And I think what we're talking about now is this incredible standardization based upon the web and the internet being the transport, which gets into all the telecommunications and all the regulatory issues, which we should talk about. And I would argue to the last panel that I'm not convinced that they missed the boat by not delivering Amazon Web Services. They missed the boat by not being Cisco at the end of the day. There were a whole bunch of layers in that stack. If you've been tracking the ISO layer over time, how many people know what that is? That's a good sign, because there's There's the physical layer. You just move on up. And the industry battled over that for 25 or 30 years about how to drive proprietary stacks and then interoperability. So as all of this stuff has been built up, Ryan's, I think, spot on, and that any, not saying any, but capable entrepreneurs with interesting ideas can reach scale, economic impact, disrupting a business model really, really, really quickly. The hard part, we'll get into, I think, the purpose of a lot of this conversation, which I find really fascinating in the earlier panels, which is what are the regulatory, the geopolitical regimes going to do when this IP capability that moves data across borders, I mean, other than air and water, maybe it's even better than electricity because the plugs are the same, at least with networks, and you don't even need plugs. It's mostly wireless now. So I do think that we're going to see for the next 10 years massive ferment and innovation that's going to blossom in lots of different ways that we can't predict by any means, but huge opportunity because of the number, just the scale, and the ease with which you can do it without investing in any capital equipment. Those two things are really important.
Yeah, I mean, I remember walking down at eBay in like 99, 2000 as we really started to scale, going off-site and being brought down into this bunker where the server farm was, and it was like something out of a science fiction movie, and the fixed cost necessary to keep up with the scale was just massive. And then I think about where we are now, and as our business kind of took off on a trajectory, and you were getting 3 and 4 million unique visitors, not only on a website, but streaming video. And you just throttle up your capacity for that weekend via AWS. It's a variable cost, not a fixed cost suddenly, and you can throttle it right back down on Monday. Our healthcare costs right now are higher than our tech infrastructure costs on a monthly basis, so that should tell you something about where we are as a society. But that's
Sarah, can you say something about it as an entrepreneur from this perspective?
Yeah, well, I think, from the entrepreneur perspective, I have, a very limited, if any, technical background. And I think that's the thing that's kind of interesting is that, I feel like I know very little about what you're talking about, and I don't have to because it's so easy now, right? It's like anyone can create an internet company and leverage all the different tools that exist without having to have this deep computer science background. So it's really not only the technology is just so easy, and
Now putting yourself back in the position 10 years ago, and given what technology was back then, might you have been deterred as an entrepreneur in your current business model?
No, I mean, so we're in our 10th year,
Yeah.
and so we existed actually 10 years ago, and I actually feel like the reason that we were able to exist is because we could leverage internet tools. I mean, I was a one-man band when I first got started, and it seemed like we were a much bigger company than we were because of all the things that we could leverage. I mean, even things like a constant contact email system made me able to, email hundreds of advertisers in 20 minutes, right? So it's like even the tools that existed then, I feel like made my business able to grow and able to scale very inexpensively at the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think another observation to riff off what Sarah was saying is that this idea of all these tools that exist, and this has become greatly amplified in the last 5 years with the emergence of the cloud, is that there are sort of these for engineers as well, right? There's these sort of core level services that you can leverage and scale very easily, and so that the technical challenge is, to some degree, becomes one more of sort of knowing how to sew different components together, as opposed to having to have a CS degree and sort of be up to snuff on your favorite sorting algorithm or how to optimize it, which kind of used to be table stakes for doing that, right? And so I think that has again sort of enabled entrepreneurs, again, who don't necessarily need to have a deep technical background to get off the ground and running and really project a bigger presence than they actually have, which is it's all a confidence game in the early days of starting a company.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Good. Any further comments on that?
I would just add to that and say that there's an immense amount of opportunity in all of the deep technical areas, whether it's in storage or processors or network or fiber and all that other kind of stuff. So there's no lack of opportunity in what we used to think about living and working in Silicon Valley as sort of the core of things, which was, okay, what are we going to do about storage and what are we going to do about, networking, and, there were, people that I knew, and, not too long ago, when you think about it in this lifetime of, say, 25 or 30 years, that used to make huge sums of money implementing TCP/IP stacks inside a corporate firewall so that they could connect, and then eventually, and there were companies that, were built around those things, and then it all just gets absorbed. So there's lots of good innovation in storage, going beyond flash and things that will be done with nanotubes and things. There's a lot of interesting stuff that in the next 15 or so years, it'll change the dynamic radically. And so this will go through a change, and but I also think there's this maybe, to the extent you can project or predict beyond, tomorrow or tonight or now, there's a long run of interesting stuff that will be all location-based, service-oriented, call them consumer, or a bridge between consumer and enterprise, public-private kinds of things. And I would give one example on that, and that is the airline industries. Most people fly United to come into Denver, and you probably feel comfortable getting your ticket using a Gmail or a Yahoo or a Live or some sort of consumer service electronic mail account as you do things. But they don't let you on the plane unless they know who you are. And you have that free email account because somebody's monitoring what you're doing, more or less, right? There's clicks and things like that. It's part of the services. And so there's this bridge which gets into the regulatory questions of, as people move around and trust and security become so fundamental, and Apple did some good things yesterday on that front. For example, just if you read the news about what they did in their payments issue, making the point, hey, we're just in the hardware business. We don't know how much the transaction was for. We don't know what you bought. We don't know any of those things, which is a huge statement to the market where you've been seeing all the action around NFC and related transactions, which is people want to monetize what they know about what you did. And so that, I think, was sort of the first fracturing, and I think the consumer behaviors will change on that, and then new businesses will emerge based upon that. Entrepreneurs will be able to build on top of what Apple's building in at the hardware level. So I just think there's all these places where things will be new and innovative.
I also think one thing to layer on that your Apple comment made me think of is going back to sort of the original question, which is, what is the shape and cycles of some of these innovations and disruptions? I've long been a big believer in late mover advantage in the technology industry, right? So, everyone talks about disruption and thinking, okay, it's always the new technology or the first to market that's going to win, but it doesn't actually tend to be true. And, and part of the reason why I think about this was because, my company that I started years ago was sort of a victim of being early, right? So I started a company called Excite, which is one of the first generation search engines, and when Google came along, who would have thought that the world needed like an 8th search engine, which, I think that was about how many there were at the time, right? But Google, by starting late, was able to make some fundamentally more informed and better decisions and sort of jump onto the sort of cost performance curve later on down the road, and ultimately be successful, right? Facebook was not the first social network, right? Think of Friendster, right? Apple's iPhone was not the first smartphone. It was like the first good packaging of it. They didn't even use a 3G modem at the time, right? And likewise, Apple's payment system is not the same.
But one would argue, to your point, as the question of who would have thought someone would get into an Uber car or do an Airbnb thing, Facebook, one could argue, succeeded because their trust framework was it was only college campuses and it was unique to the campus. When with MySpace and a lot of the other ones were all about everything was by default public to everyone. Yep. And so Facebook in the beginning actually had a competitive advantage and trust within the community of that university admissions filter, right, which people believed in.
And they forced people to use their real names, right? And I think that was a sea change as well, right?
Exactly.
Right? Because, otherwise I'd still be known as Van Halen, which was my Stanford email address my freshman year, I'm sorry to say.
So, I mean, I think that lesson, if you look back, which does go back, 10 years now, roughly, and you extrapolate forward, those things will repeat themselves. Again, I think the real opportunities will be based upon some of those real truths, because eventually people care about that, I think.
Okay, good. So let's shift gears a little bit, and I want to push off the regulatory and law question to the next question. And so this is going to be focused on the business side. So disruptions may be good for the disruptors, but they're bad for the disrupted. So how shall incumbents deal with disruptive technology or business models, the so-called innovator's dilemma, a la Clayton Christensen? Let me throw that to John.
As opposed to looking at this in an academic or technology lens, I think it's interesting to look at it on a human behavior and organizational design lens. I don't think if we brought anyone in here from Blockbuster or Circuit City 4 years before their demise, they wouldn't have told you exactly what was going to happen. And they just, and I've talked to these folks, and I see it happening now in industries as well. And you talk to smart people there, and they know it's coming, but they simply can't do anything about it. And it's almost it's sad to watch in some ways, because there's this pervasive frustration and paralysis that goes on. And so you ask why. And I think it's a combination of leadership, organizational structure, and incentive. And, we talk about it, and I won't name names of companies that we're disrupting because there's no reason to ever poke the giant. But you have executives that are 59 years old. They're 4 years off from retirement. There's way more downside for them to poke their head up and take a chance on either investing in new technology, disrupting same-store sales or a current profitable channel than there is in going and taking a chance. They would rather just ride it out for 4 more years, make their $500,000 a year, and go off into the sunset. You got to fire those people. Honestly, they got to go. They've been there too long. They've made too much money already, and they're not hungry enough. And so that doesn't mean hire someone younger. This isn't an age thing. It means someone who hasn't been there as long in that org and still needs to make a lot of money. And then you have to structure comp to reward these people significantly for disrupting and I think in many ways get them off-site, away from the mothership, because it's not apples and oranges when you're looking at disruptive technology. It's pumpkins and grapes, right? You have this huge kind of cash flow stream that's atrophying, but it is still a cash flow stream, and people are going to ride that. That initiative is always going to win for internal resources because that is the historical cash flow. So I think, like, seeing how, of all people, Walmart did it online was they just got it out of Bentonville. I mean, they put Walmart.com in the valley where they could attract the right talent and have a separate, kind of a separate org, if you will. I think in the being able to sell the story to the public markets, why you're doing something as well, that's part of the reason a lot of people get handcuffed too, is their Horizon 1 goals are so tied to quarterly or annual economics, as opposed to even being able to see into the Horizon 2 of 3 to 5 years out. And that once again comes back to people do the personal calculus on their vesting schedule and their salary and how long they have to go to retirement, whether to stick their neck out a little.
So I'm going to throw that out to the panel, either reactions to this or your own answers to that question.
I feel like it's so much of a personality thing too. I mean, I think that, the person, regardless of how much money they've made, it has nothing to do with how much money they've made. It has all to do with their appetite for disruption and their energy to go figure out something new, and the idea that they're always innovating their company, right? It's the stale leadership that says, we're making money, we don't need to change anything. That's the most expensive thing you can say in business, right? Is that's the way we've always done it. We should keep doing it that way. So I feel like that's the thing that's so great for entrepreneurs, is that there are people that just want to keep doing it the same way. So if you can, fly under the radar long enough where they don't notice you until you're so big, it's a huge problem. They have to either buy you, or you can totally, bankrupt their business anyways. But I think that those people just don't exist in the same types of organizations.
I think Appetite for Disruption is my favorite Guns N' Roses album. but I think when you think about the big companies that are victims of disruption, I think there's a few shining examples, I think, of big companies or approaches you can take to sort of help make sure that you're less likely to be disrupted, right? And so, the first thing I'm going to say is very self-serving, but, companies in the Valley do it all the time, which is they acquire the disruptive startups and incorporate them into their DNA. And of course, as a venture capitalist, 9 out of 10 of our exits are via M&A as opposed to IPO. So, of course, I'm gonna say that, but that's, there's a long tradition in Silicon Valley in particular. I mean, entire companies like Cisco were basically built on, having their IP developed outside of the company and then sort of bringing it in as technologies took off. So, that's one thing big companies can do. The other one is fostering sort of a culture of, crazy thinking or side projects or whatever, right? So you look at Google with Google X, or the 20% time, that sort of brought forth a bunch of important products for Google, like Gmail, right? And then, the other one is having a willingness, and again, this is top down, bottoms up, whatever, but it's inherent to the culture of the company. And again, I'm choosing technology companies as, ones who are sort of less, as sort of the guideposts for, how as a big company can you sort of either benefit from the disruption or disrupt yourself. And that's kind of the final thing that I would say. And there's, a few great case studies of big technology companies disrupting themselves. And the ones that make a habit of it are the ones that tend to, be successful over a long period of time. One of my favorites is just the story of Netflix, right? Where, this is a company that started out, mailing DVDs around, right? And I think Netflix probably always wanted to be a streaming video company, but when they got started, the bandwidth of a DVD on a FedEx truck or a U.S. Postal Service truck was better than most people could get in their homes, right? And so
Reed can do the calculation that I laid out up front. He's pretty good at that.
Exactly.
Right.
I did a blog post a few years ago about what the peak bandwidth of Netflix was coming out of their DVD shipping, and it was, it was like, I don't know, 25 gigabits or something. So it was a long time before they could do that, economically, actually streaming digitally. Apple's disrupted themselves a number of times. Many companies would have said, hey, should we put a music player in the iPhone? It might kill our great iPod business, right? Should we make the iPad? That might put a dent in our, in our phone business, right? Things like that. And so, I think those are all sort of, important things, right? Buy the disruptors, do sort of, allow your employees to work on crazy projects or side projects, and then ultimately be willing to disrupt yourself.
Yeah. Well, it's never happened at Microsoft, none of this. I don't have anything to say. I think it's twofold. I think it's culture, which is what people have said. And then the second is you get trapped by your customers, right? You get trapped by the market that you serve. And you have to decide how you work from that and make change. And you can't do it without changing the culture. So it's a leadership point. I think you nailed it. And, the end of the day, the board has to make decisions, and or the CEO who makes investment decisions about where the resources go has to bet on people who will execute. And if the people who they bet on want to execute and won't change, then they need to replace them. And so it starts with the board, et cetera. But the strength, in a different way, I would talk briefly about IBM, and I'm happy to talk about Microsoft as well, because we're in the middle of this right now. It's really an incredibly interesting time, and I couldn't be happier about all the changes that are underway. It's incredible. But IBM is a company that's always been, they're a great company. They just had a 100-year anniversary. Are they a technology company today? Sort of.
Services, though?
Yeah. But they decided, based upon serving their customers, how they would survive in the technology business. And they thrive within that. 40% of the systems integration business in the world. I mean, it's other is kind of everything else. And so how they do that from a culture and a leadership perspective is genius. I mean, and they know, I think, and are they sad they missed the PC thing in whatever way they missed it? Sure. But I can tell you from personal experience, having worked with IBM in 1986, when I was working at Next. I had just left Apple, and we were starting this company called Next. And we worked with IBM. And they knew in 1986, at a senior management level, that they did not want to be in the PC business. In 1986. Windows 2.0 was on the market, wasn't even 3.0, and it took 3.1 with networking extensions to make it work, really, and Windows 95 was a long way away. They knew then that the economics behind microprocessors and where that business was going, they didn't want, but they also said, we have to serve our customer. So they wanted to work with us at Next because they thought we could be a balance between Intel and Microsoft. And they propped up Intel by investing in Intel because they knew microprocessors need to, when they flipped from memory to, so I mean, they were so smart at a management level that they knew they had to change, and then they gave up on certain things and they invested in others. So I think what you said is spot on. And I do believe that you're trapped by your customer. You have to figure out at what moment you are strong enough with a certain set of customer bases that you can effectively make change and give up on the old model, which is frankly what Microsoft is doing right now. We're changing the model, but we've got a core that's, when you look at the numbers, is very, very, very strong. So the balance sheet isn't screaming at us and saying you have to do something, which Apple nearly went out of business, and IBM had their gazillion-dollar write-down.
And Microsoft saved Apple from...
Yeah, and Microsoft propped up Apple with a big investment, and within a month or two of them failing. So the dynamics, self-imposed or market-imposed, are driven by culture and then understanding what your core is and how you serve your core. And Apple was particularly strong at serving their core because they had developed a marketing technique which was tied to values, attitudes, and lifestyles, and not to particular products. And they serviced that model on marketing techniques that were taken from George Lucas and the Star Wars phenomenon, and the research done at SRI called VALS, about values, attitudes, and lifestyles. And smart people guided the company to stay true to that, which is to maintain resonance with a demographic of a 17 to 35-year-old. And the reason why they do that is because, I don't know about you, but anybody that I know that's less than 17 wishes they were 18, and anybody that's over than 35 remembers fondly when they were 17 to 35. So it's a place where we all live, whether you're a buyer in a corporate world or, a 14-year-old or a 36-year-old, right? But in the middle, that's what they go after, and that doesn't change. So they're very smart about that, and they could service it with new products and services, and very disruptive in their industrial attacks.
So those are all great points. I especially like the point about disrupting yourselves. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but I think there's a quote from the Steve Jobs biography where he's talking about cannibalizing his product lines. He says something to the effect, if we don't disrupt ourselves, someone will do it for us. So, all right, so shifting gears, this being a law school, of course, we have to talk about the law. So what should the role of government and law be when we have a disruptive business model? So what comes to mind are companies like Uber, Airbnb, and Lyft versus the state regulations and the city regulations that are playing out. On the one hand, you have health and safety regulations designed for kind of a previous industry, whether the taxi industry or the hotel industry. On the other hand, you have these new business models that don't play as well with the existing regulations and the possibility of rent sinking. So let me throw that out to Sarah and then the rest of the panel.
Well, I think this is a really interesting question, and I think one of the main questions to really ask is, who are we protecting? What's the goal here? Is the goal to protect the consumer, or is the goal to protect the industry, or even the people who are employed by the industry in the case of Uber? So when we think about Uber and getting into an Uber car, I mean, how many people here have ridden in an Uber car? Okay, so a huge, huge amount. And if you think about what happens when you get in an accident in an Uber, right? Does anyone know what the outcome is? Have you experienced that? I mean, so one of the things, one of the big criticisms of Uber is that they only carry $1 million policy on an accident. And so if anyone here has been in a serious car accident, $1 million can go really fast when you've got a really serious medical situation or someone dies and there's a lawsuit, right? So $1 million doesn't really go very far. So I think it's really interesting because the regulations that were put in place are meant to protect the consumer. That's the intent, right? But I think the thing that's so fuzzy is that the people who are creating those regulations are often influenced by the very companies that are causing that disruption. So two big cases, if you think about the FDA or even the FAA, both of those government agencies really rely on the companies that are producing either the drugs or airplanes or the drones. In another example of innovation, they're really relying on those companies to tell them what the legislation should be, and even to test their product, right? So the FDA does some testing, but it's certainly not to the extent where it means that a consumer is protected. So I think it's a question really, again, going back to, are we protecting the public? Are we protecting the consumer? Are we protecting the company? And then even with the consumers, I think that there's a certain place where we have to say the consumer has to take some responsibility for the products that they're using, the products that they're choosing, because the government really can't intervene fast enough, especially in a case like Uber or Airbnb, where things just move so quickly and there's so much public outcry for the service that it's too late, right? And I think, too, the public really determines the success of these companies and really makes them have enough of a public safety net. We don't hear about tons of Craigslist killers or Uber accidents or people whose homes have been trashed by Airbnb. They're exceptions, right? Because I think the company is so careful to make sure that those things aren't happening. So I feel like it's really a balance of regulation and really making sure that the people who are creating the laws aren't heavily influenced. There was this article yesterday about Uber, actually, that they just hired a senior official from the Obama administration to be their new government relations department. So it's like even these very disruptive companies have to come in and do the same things that the companies that they're disrupting have done in terms of regulation.
Let me throw it out to the panel, balancing laws protecting incumbents and stifling innovation versus genuinely protecting our citizens.
Yeah, well, I think the tension's always there, because by nature the government, regulatory regimes, legal regimes, especially in the technology world, when they're subject to disruption, by definition can't keep up with the change. In the specific case of Uber, and again, look, I'm my career depends on disruption and change, but I think the Uber case in particular, to me, this is an example of doing something that is fundamentally better, right? Like it's going to, I think Uber at scale, it will potentially be cheaper to take an Uber everywhere than to own your own car, right? It drives much better resource utilization, right? And when Uber first started, it was just focused, by the way, on the black car industry. So it was taking an existing phenomenon of licensed chauffeurs, right, who have their own licensing regime, and pretty much all chauffeurs were already working as independent contractors anyway, right? Like the person who drives your Kerry limo is an independent contractor that they're just...
The person who drives a FedEx truck is an independent contractor.
That they're just dispatching out to. And so Uber was able to kind of move in there with this totally, autonomous and virtual dispatch and logistics and payment system that, provided something that was fundamentally better, enabling all these drivers to make a better living, more convenient for the consumer. There's no coincidence that it started in San Francisco, which has one of the worst taxi cab systems in the world. I was a 17-year Bay Area resident and spent many, white knuckle harrowing drives in the back of an insane taxi driver's car. And I think that the spread of Uber is one of these things that it's sort of a fundamentally important consumer experience. It also is enabling an economy and the profession for the drivers that's, I think, important. And to me, Uber really puts a magnifying glass on kind of sort of the most grotesque incumbency and actions that I've seen, in a long time with, the sort of taxi lobbies, the owners of the medallions who are just, deep in bed with some of the municipalities and city governments, basically making up, totally absurd, laws or regulations in a, just in a brazen and blatant attempt to protect their incumbency and prevent the innovation. And it's, it's one of those, it just,
it's glaring.
That steams me.
I agree, it's glaring. I agree.
You might add Tesla to that similar list.
Yeah, with the car dealerships.
Right. The health and safety of the public.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where I find so much of things that, so craven when it's hiding behind protecting the consumer, and really in the San Francisco or Chicago case of the cab industry, it's quasi-mafia control.
Who owns the medallions,
right? So let's call it what it is, which is a corrupt lobby trying to protect their financial interests. We've all been in cabs that are, same with the same with the hotel industry. And it goes back to, I guess the older I get, the more suspicious I get of regulation in general. I mean, the banking industry, the chronic round-tripping of Goldman executives from banking to regulatory, back to banking. There should be some rule that if you leave private industry to go into a regulatory agency, you can't go back. You're going into
a one-way ticket.
You cannot do your time and then be accepted back in. You're either a public servant on a regulatory agency or not. So I don't know. I mean, there's obviously cases with drugs and different things where we need protection potentially, but yet in that industry, there's legitimate drugs that have been held up for 5 years, and yet, turn on TV and there's completely unregulated supplements and nonsense being sold as snake oil that has never been tested, and it's been handed out like it's $1 billion industry.
Yeah.
Can I get one more quick reaction? Because then I want to save some time for the,
Sure.
the audience.
I would agree with everything people have said. I think there's two levels to think about. One is, sort of inter-country regulatory regime issues that we just, looked across. And then there's the international issues that are inevitable. And I say that from, again, with the Microsoft hat on, the perspective of large industries that have, employees in 150 countries or more around the world. We're one of them. And so what does it mean, for example, given the lawsuit that we filed against the US government, what does it mean to be asked to deliver someone's papers, quote unquote, that exist in a data center that's not in the United States and it's a US citizen? And so I think there are really big long-term issues. That's where I was kind of giving the airline industry sort of thing. It's like, who's really on the airplane? The industry wants to know certain things. So I do think there's a level of identity and trust and transparency to all of your points that's going to have to come about, and is probably going to come about as a result of the mobile device that you carry in some way. And that's where I think, maybe in summary from my standpoint, that's where the model might change, that your reputation, your identity, your currencies, whether they're your Amex points or your dollars or your whatever, will reside in some way, and you'll choose to let people know who you are based upon an exchange of value. You'll have control over those. So I think it'll change by industry and by type, and then there'll be all the different businesses that'll attack the incumbencies that people have described.
Okay, great. So let me open it up to the audience. Do I have a student out there? I don't cold call in my class. I look for very willing volunteers. Do I have any very willing volunteers who are students in the back? No? All right, so I will open it up to the audience at large then. Okay, we want someone in the back?
Yes, you didn't really talk about, I think, a technology that may be one of the biggest disruptors coming up, and that's artificial intelligence. Would you guys care to comment on that?
I can do it from the cheap seats. Ryan can probably talk more deeply. I mean, machine learning is the way we generally talk about it and think about it. And it's these large clusters of machines that are actually being harnessed to solve really interesting problems. And we had a bunch of, Microsoft has 1,000 PhDs, lion's share of computer scientists, so that makes us the world's largest computer science department because we don't tell them what to do. We only hire them in the fields that we think are important to our future. And they were off with these folks at University of Toronto for 10 years playing with some hard problems on language translation and things like that. And finally, based upon some of these large clusters of machines that we now have, they've cracked through. So there's an immense amount of innovative work being done on these core, I call it sort of the rise of the machines, and it's, Jeopardy is the trivial example, right? In terms of they took a corpus, Wikipedia, and they attacked it with a bunch of machines. But Google's doing it and we're doing it, and then by the researchers' estimates, not mine, but smart people in this field sort of suggest that it's sort of Microsoft and Google that have the best talent in that space, and IBM's got pretty good talent too, sort of the way they're saying it. And I think the problems they're going to solve on medical issues and science and health issues and quantified self-related things that will be captured, and then all that is going to change, I think, personal health and all kinds of other things, hopefully education as well.
Yeah, I think there are some, shame on us for not bringing it up, because I do think that the phenomena underlying sort of the deep learning revolution, which is the idea of these sort of deep convolving neural networks, right? That there is the terminology for it that's going on at Google and Microsoft and whatnot, has enabled specifically some pretty amazing leaps forward in the area of image recognition. So there's this corpus called ImageNet that's 1 million images, and there's a sort of set way for measuring the success of these vision algorithms to where you give them one object and say, okay, go find all instances of this object in this 1 million image database and whatnot. And it's been a competition that's sort of runs every year annually. And researchers up until a few years ago had gotten it to be maybe sort of 80% accurate, or missing kind of 20-25% of the time. And then they started to apply this deep learning technique, and it went from 25% error rate down to a 15% error rate. And then basically everyone who came back in the subsequent years, in 2012, alls were doing sort of variants of this kind of deep neural learning for image recognition. And now it was just reported there's a group at Google that just got it down to a 6.7% error rate, which is basically
astounding. Yeah.
Which is basically just a little bit better actually than humans, right? And so there's going to be some really amazing stuff that is enabled by this. And what's interesting about the deep learning is that this is stuff that existed in sort of academic papers. Sort of the techniques were proposed a decade or more ago, but the world lacked the computing infrastructure to actually do it at scale, right? It's taken Google and Microsoft with having thousands or tens of thousands of servers to compute power to be able to run these simulations on to pull this off, right? And so I think we're going to see a lot more. As an undergrad, I studied symbolic systems at Stanford, and my focus was actually artificial intelligence, and I became very jaded actually as a result of studying this in the late 80s and early 90s.
Never going to happen, right?
Because artificial intelligence was one of these things that was sort of, it's going to be just around the corner, and we're going to have Rosie the robot and sentient machines. And I think we're nowhere near any sort of machine sentience or an intelligence that we recognize in sort of an executive functioning human, anything like a consciousness, but the level of intelligence in very specific vertical domains, machines are going to outperform humans in things that we used to think were sort of uniquely human, like vision.
Driving cars. I mean,
driving cars.
You start thinking about Uber and the issues associated with that, it's like really the policy and regulatory issues around that are front and center. And then when you've got, Tesla, and that battery factory is not about building batteries for cars. It's a storage grid they're going to build. Think about it. They want it's going to, because we're capturing stuff everywhere. It's got to be stored. It's got to be moved, and it's a very big play, and it's genius. And from the cars, and there's just so many applications for this new machine learning. So you bring up a wonderful point that we failed to talk about.
So we've got one more minute, and I'll just put in a plug. My research I actually do on artificial intelligence and law, and the way it talk about disrupting things that used to only be done by humans. Some of these machine learning techniques are starting to be applied to things like legal prediction and whatnot.
And then there's a fundamental question about, are the algorithms that are performing on your behalf regulatable?
Okay, one quick question from the audience. Over here. We'll just have time for one response.
In the same spirit of artificial intelligence, with the paradigm shift from an internet infrastructure that everybody was hungry for bandwidth at one time, and everybody's thinking bandwidth from internet, there's the paradigm shift to a data-centric, from a QoS to a QoE, quality of service to quality of experience. Quality of experience usually drives your movie choices, your book preferences that Amazon and Netflix come up with. Usually they recommend choices for you. That information that is gathered from the intelligence that's within the data that's transmitted, how protected is the customer, will the customer be from propagating that information out?
All right, anyone?
Right now, you're the product, right? And they provide a service, and there's it's like the uncanny valley. There's this creepy place where you end up when they start to recommend things to you based upon purchases that you made on behalf of, your niece or something. And it's like, but pretty soon you're okay with it, right? So there's this edge that you roll into as a result of these algorithms performing on your behalf, and there's a fair exchange or you wouldn't be using the service. And eventually, I do think there's an opportunity for that control. You'll decide maybe to do business with someone who will disrupt Amazon because they'll provide a front end that says, the data trail is your own, and you can express your interest. And we'll pick 3 Bs. You're interested in balloons, bicycles, and BMWs. Okay, great. So market to me based upon that because I've expressed my preference and I'm interested in that trade-off. So those things could change over time, but right now you're the product.
All right, so we are out of time, but please join me in thanking our panelists here.
You guys should fund it.